Hi everyone. So I'm here to talk about the role of the research office. Obviously, I'm from a UK research office, and I know a lot of you are not from the UK. I'm also a joint research office, so half of my role is an NHS trust, St George's, and then the other half is the university. So it's quite a unique position that I'm here to talk about. I do tend to talk quite fast. I tend to use quite a lot of acronyms. So if I'm talking too fast or I don't explain something, please just stop me and I can explain myself. So in terms of what a research office does, to most senior researchers, we are a black hole of misery and pain inflicted to give you pain. But I'm quite a positive person, so this is just going to be about the positive aspects about what a research office actually does. So this is the most heavy slide, and then it'll be quick. So Giuseppe was talking about earlier a phone book of phone up the charities and find out funding opportunities. Research offices have a big section, the grant section, and one of the main things is they identify potential funding opportunities. So they know all the major charities, they know the call out that the governments might be asking for. So in the UK, for example, the next big drive is for dementia. So we know that there's going to be a lot of money coming in terms of like a dementia study. So we go and we tell our researchers, these are the sort of things that you can apply for funding for. And we also have government funding as well in terms of NIHR, which is the National Institute of Healthcare Research, and they put call-outs as well to say we're looking for a study that can demonstrate something to do with patient benefit, for example. So the research office does know funding opportunities. One of the other main things that we do is we do the costing and pre-award support. So before you get your grant, we'll help you work up your grant applications. Just a point here, I'm not a financial background. I'm the traffic warden of research, so I'm compliance and governance. So I have a generalist knowledge of finance stuff, but it's not my speciality. One of the main things that often gets forgotten about grant applications, or researchers try and fudge it slightly, is the grants often have a ceiling where they won't award more than, say, $350,000, and then the investigators have to try and work back and try and make the research study cost that amount. That's where we start getting into arguments in terms of the research office versus the investigators, because the researchers want the grant, and we want the money. We want the study to often continue for the length that it's supposed to. If you undercost something, you'll get halfway through your study and you would have run out of money. So we try and make sure that it's a fully funded, costed study. Areas that get left out of grant applications tend to be things that you'll never remember to include. Things like statisticians. You might put in money for them to help you do the power calculations to create the study. But actually, a lot of the stats is at the end when you have your data analysis. Probably 80% of the applications we get through for grant costings only have the stats bit at the beginning, and then they haven't included anything at the back end. So we try and make sure that that sort of thing is included. The other thing with costings is that researchers, you underestimate your time and your value to us. So we often have costings where the researcher says, it's going to take me 5 minutes to fill in a form. Well, if that form is 10 pages long and you have to go into different systems, that's obviously a lot more than 10 minutes, and we try and cost your time in properly. So that's one of the things the finance team does. Once you have your big grant, congratulations. We also then look at the financial management and administration of your grants and the contracts. So, for example, you might have a charity that gives you a large sum of money, but they say you can't have any of it until you have your ethics in place. So the grants team will make sure that you have your ethics and you comply with the terms of your grant. Because what you don't want is a charity to bring in an auditor and something's not up to scratch. The next thing is my area of expertise and things that I love doing, so providing guidance on the ethics process. If you're a researcher that's brand new, it can be extremely daunting trying to get through the ethics process. There's millions of forms. I can actually say it's got easier after the last 10 years. It used to be more horrendous than it is now. They are trying to smooth it out. So we will basically sit down with a researcher and take them through the process. For example, in the UK, there's going to be massive changes in the next 12 months because the HRA, which is the Health Research Agency Authority, I never get the A right, they're introducing a new process. So how you apply to ethics is going to change by December. So we don't know what the process is because we haven't been told, which is useful, but we will go out and tell the researchers when we do know what the process is. So again, research officers should be your first point of call. Then we have sponsorship of the clinical studies. So when you've got your brilliant idea, you want to sponsor, as an academic institution, we will sponsor your study. We look at all your paperwork. We make sure that you're complying with both the sponsor's policies and procedures, but also that you're complying with the law of the land, because we don't want you to get arrested on the papers because we've told you something incorrect. So we do sponsor a lot of studies at St. George's. Host site approval, this is where you go into, say, an NHS trust and you say, this is my study, please approve it. St. George's, we approved about 200 studies last year. It's about average for us. And we'll look at things like, we'll go to the support departments. If you're using imaging, we'll go and say to the imaging department, do you have capacity to do this? We'll go to pathology. We'll go to the departments that you want to go into. So it's a real thorough sort of feasibility that we do for these studies. In terms of costing for clinical studies, this is for drug studies, so this might be of interest to you. We obviously have monitors, traffic wardens, and so we will cost in for their time. We'll work out how many sites, we'll work out how risky your study is, whether you need a very high level of monitoring. One thing that also gets forgotten is that it costs to apply to run one of these studies. The MHRA in this country charges anywhere from £300 to £3,500 to do a study, so we make sure that that's included in your application. We also do all aspects of clinical research governance. So we will attend site feasibilities if we have to, site selections. We'll go along to the departments, meet with the pharma companies if it's a pharma study or non-commercial. If it's one of our own studies, we'll go and do the site initiation. So we'll make sure the study team understands what the study's about, what their reporting requirements are, who they can go to if they have complaints. We do a lot of audit and monitoring. So I've got a team of 8, and we are all qualified auditors. We'll go out and audit studies and monitor them. It's actually my favorite thing to do. I love auditing. I think I was born to be a dictator, essentially. And then also a key thing is obviously the safety reporting, because we are giving patients novel drugs or devices, and it's imperative that everyone knows what their reporting requirements are for safety. So we'll teach the researchers what they have to do in terms of safety reporting. And then the final thing, so it's basically, cradle to grave, we'll also do a study closeout. So we'll go out to the sites, or, at St. George's, we'll make sure all the data queries have been answered. We'll make sure that all the paperwork's appropriate, everything's been covered, and then we'll close down the study and actually archive it off-site for our researchers. I don't have a finance background. I've just realised that I forgot to add in that we are also responsible for invoicing. So we do make sure that the researchers get the money back for the work that they've done. So the researchers will tell us, I've 10 studies have finished their visits, can you invoice the company? This also is another area that we have discussions with the researchers, because more and more pharma companies or commercial companies, and actually a lot of non-commercials, it used to historically be that they just paid you when the patient completed. So you said, 10 patients have completed, can I have my money for that, please? But what happened is that the data was actually quite unclean. There was a lot of patients lost to follow-up, and they couldn't go back and answer the queries. And actually, the data sets then became useless because they couldn't actually use that patient. So now what they tend to do is they say it's on completion of a complete clean data set. So you might be thinking that you're going to get invoiced for 15 patients, but the monitors come in and said, actually, there's only 5 sets so far, so we're only going to pay you for 5. So then you have this constant battle of trying to get the invoicing even. So that is quite a difficult area. Monitoring and reporting on research activity. This is more and more issue in the UK if you are involved in research. So research activity, the NIHR, which is the National Institute of Healthcare Research, they're how the trusts get money back for studies. So we have to report on a monthly basis how many patients we put into their adopted studies. We have a full-time person whose job is just to report back to them on patient recruitment. And it's more an issue going forward. So we monitor and we report on our research activity. Oh, in terms of the audit, we also have financial audits. So the charities will actually send in auditors to make sure we're doing things appropriately. So it's not just the research governance side of things, it's also financial audits as well. And we do training and guidance for all aspects of research administration. So like the session that I'm doing now, we also teach in a couple of master courses at the university, and we have monthly workshops where we talk about different aspects of research. So we have one on informed consent, we have one on protocol development, we have one on code breaking. So it's just little snippets, so you have an overview and you can go and find more information afterwards. So it's a whole package that we offer. And then coordinating external audits and regulatory inspections. I've been inspected by the MHRA and the FDA, both in this job and in my previous one at Imperial. And I actually think the MHRA, controversially, are more thorough than the FDA. I've only ever had one FDA one, so it's maybe not a comparison because I've had 4 MHRA inspections, but I definitely preferred the MHRA if I had to choose. Okay, so this is what our office at St. George's looks like, just as an example. But like I said, every office is going to be different because you have universities, you have NHS trusts. So we do have a joint office, which isn't actually that rare because we had one at Imperial as well. So we have the director of the office. She reports into the Dean of Research on the university side, and then she reports into the Associate Medical Director on the trust side. Then we have a coordinator who organises diaries, so she's not that exciting. So this research performance manager, so she's solely responsible for the NIHR patient activity that I was talking about. That's all she does. She tries to get the researchers to meet targets. She will also iron out any bottlenecks in the system. That light green is not just me. I do have a team underneath me, but that's just the whole governance section. And then we have the pre-awards and post-awards that kind of sit together. The R&D finance, weirdly, is kind of a free-floating scenario because they don't actually directly report into us. It's a weird setup that they would just report into this finance person, so they actually are just free floaters in our office. We have a research policy manager, most universities do, where we get edicts from the government to say you have to comply with this policy, or show us that you are anti-fraud, anti-corruption, that sort of thing. And Bryony's job is basically to pull a document together to comply with those policies. So that's a full-time position itself. And then we have a legal person, a lawyer, Sebastian, who is great. And then this is called Enterprise and Innovation. So it's called something different in virtually every R&D office that you go into. They're the people who deal with the spin-outs, the intellectual property, confidentiality. So they kind of sit with us, but they are quite on their own. So this is like the standard one, but in most R&D offices, you'll have a governance and finance and legal section. Those are the 3 main areas. So in terms of what the actual regulations we deal with in the UK are, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but when we get an application, then these are the sort of regulations that we have to have in the back of our minds when we look at things. So the Research Governance Framework, that covers all research in the NHS that is not a drug study. The Data Protection Act, that basically says you have to keep personal data of patients to a minimum. It has to be in a secure environment. You can't share it with unnecessary people. And if you do, you have to tell patients or participants what you're doing with their data. With most regulations in this country, none of them are proactive. They've all been reactive as a result of something that's happened in the past. The Human Tissue Act, 2004, was on the back of a scandal where virtually every single NHS trust in the country was found to be holding tissue of patients without their knowledge or consent. So the Human Tissue Act, even if you collect a urine sample, that's considered relevant material. So that's the key term for that act. It's anything that contains a whole human cell in it is relevant material under this act, and you have to abide by it. So blood samples, urine samples, any form of swab, we make sure that you're compliant with that regulation. The Mental Capacity Act basically governs people who don't have the capacity to consent to research. So that might be somebody who's had a stroke and is unconscious, or somebody who's had a car accident and is unconscious. But it also covers people who have the capacity to consent and then lose it. So someone, say with dementia, starts off being able to consent and then loses it over time. The Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulations, even people from the EU countries, you will have some form of that law in your country, because it's off the back of the EU directive. So we've transposed it into UK law under this regulation, but all of your countries would have transposed it into something slightly different. That's a regulation that's about to change. It's under guidance at the moment. The UK shouldn't see too much of a change, because when the EU directive originally came out, we took it pretty much word for word and translated it in. A lot of other countries were a bit more fluid in their interpretation, so they're going to have to change a bit more, but hopefully we won't. And any research in the NHS has to abide by the Code of Confidentiality, which basically talks about keeping patients' data safe and secure and not sending it out. So those are kind of the key things that we look at. In terms of who we deal with, in terms of the office, so like I said, the support departments, pathology, imaging, we'll make sure we have regular contact with them. We speak a lot to the ethics committees. Sometimes ethics committees overstep their remit, and they start telling researchers they have to change certain things. I then tend to get into polite discussions with them and make sure that the researchers are protected from an ethics committee. If they get unfavourable opinions, I'll sit down with the researcher and we'll try and make a letter of appeal to the ethics committee. We obviously speak with the investigators to put their studies through, but we also have to deal with complaints from investigators. They will often come to us. I'm the main point of fraud and complaints for both organisations and research, and sometimes I get investigators coming to complain about other researchers, so you have to be quite diplomatic. We do deal with the regulators, so the regulators will come to us and they'll say we want to inspect you, or we want to inspect a certain study, and we will liaise and make sure that their visit is okay. We will deal with the funders and make sure that we're compliant with them, research team members. Other NHS trusts we deal with, often with the CROs, which is another person that we deal with. They'll say, well, every other trust in the country has approved the study except you, what's the problem? And we'll call up the other NHS trust and we'll say, did you sign this agreement? And they said, no, we're not signing it because there's massive problems. So CROs are quite cheeky in doing that, but then we will phone up the other NHS trusts and make sure. Because we are a university, we deal a lot with students and student applications, because although they're students, they still have to go through the same ethics process as the most senior professor. So I teach on 2 master student programs. I probably deal with about 100 applications from students from those 2 programs every year. They need a lot of hand-holding, but they are very enthusiastic, so that's great. The other thing we do is we do have a lot of members of the public calling us. So that's not just complaints from people who've been taking part in research, but often what happens is researchers will speak to the media and they'll tell them about their studies. Obviously, we want that to happen. And then members of the public will see that article. They can't remember who the doctor is. They can't remember what the drug was. They'll just call up the comms office and say, hi, I read about a doctor. I want to be in their study. And the comms office will call me up and say, Lucy, there's a study. I don't know anything about it. Who's been in the media lately? And I have to phone around and see who's been involved. Members of the public also don't often know who to direct their queries to. So they might have an idea, or they might want to take part in research, but they don't really know how to go about it. So we have an open door policy. Our patients just walk in and say, I want to be part of a study, and we will try and match them with the researcher. We also get members of the public asking slightly random questions, like I got somebody recently who wanted to donate their body for research, and that was a query that came through to me, and I had to try and find out who they could speak to. And lastly, we do deal with other departments like the audit office. In this country, if it's a service evaluation or an audit, you don't need ethics. And so sometimes researchers try and fudge things and say it's an audit, and the audit office will phone me up and say, this isn't an audit, what do you think? And so again, we have to be quite diplomatic with that. So it's quite a variety of people we have to deal with. It's not just a black hole that it goes into. Okay, so in terms of how the governance team, because I see us as the linchpin of the research office, with the finance team, we ask for costings and we inform when the studies are closed and open, because obviously that's the whole invoicing. And we also actually we charge a setup fee, and we normally charge an archiving fee as well. So it's, again, money coming back to the researcher. We liaise with pre-awards, like I said, so we ask for certain things to be costed in, because they obviously don't have the governance experience, so they will come and ask us what needs to be included. And like I was saying, because certain charities say that you have to have ethics in place before they will release the funds, pre-awards will come to us and say, is ethics actually required for this, or can we go ahead and release the funds? Because if we tell them at the point that they're applying for grants, they can start off the ethics process. Ethics and R&D permission in this country takes about 3 months. So if you can get your ethics application going at the stage you're applying for grants, then you'll be good to go by the time your grant comes through. In terms of the enterprise or innovations, we have to send the confidentiality disclosure agreements to them. Commercial companies often send this out to say, we're interested in you taking part in our study, we want to send you the protocol, but we're not going to do it until you sign a confidentiality agreement. We check those agreements because sometimes they put really inappropriate things into it, which shouldn't be in that agreement, it should be in the main agreement, so we will check those. Enterprise will also look and see for our sponsored studies whether there's intellectual property. So can this be spun out, or can it be patented for patented? And post-awards, again, we inform them when the studies are open, because they're going to have to start reporting back to the funders, and again, also inform when the studies are closed down. Then we've got legal. So in this country, we have, it's quite good actually, we have what's called model agreements. So that's been reviewed by the Department of Health, most big pharma companies, a lot of NHS trusts. There's about 4 or 5 of them. There's a commercial one, a non-commercial one, and it's a set agreed template. So my governance officers can review those, and if there hasn't been too many changes, they can sign off that agreement themselves. If, however, someone decides to use a non-model agreement, that then has to go to the legal person, and then you have 2 lawyers who can then take a year to go through it. The other thing that we ask the legal to do is ask for material transfer agreements, or MTAs, to be completed. A lot of researchers think that material only refers to tissue that I was talking about, relevant material, but it can also be data. So if you have a big database, you will probably want that to be protected. And then any other legal advice that's needed. And then finally, for those in the UK, our NHR performance manager, we get her to do a feasibility to see whether we can actually run the study, inform when there's bottlenecks in the system, because she'll have to go and sort them out, and then also to keep the data of our performance up to speed. And this is just touting what I've done in the last 2 years. So we have done a few amount of audits. So we've done about 31. It's only about 7%. Like I said, we had 2 MHRA inspections, 1 FDA. 1 MHRA inspection and the FDA were both for one product. It was a blood product that was going to get licensed, both here and in the US. So the FDA actually flew out to inspect it. We've trained about 160 people on our training courses. We've trained just under 300 on GCP, which we've also done in our master's students as well. So we're starting to put it in, as someone suggested, we're starting to put it into our master's students' courses. We've updated 19 standard operating procedures and added another 28. So we have made it even more tightly regulated, and created about 19 working practice documents. So we're always trying to standardize processes across the trust as much as possible, because then everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, in terms of space, we've archived 154 studies in the last 2 years. We've archived a lot more than that, but that was 154 that actually had costs, that had an archiving fee in the contract. So it's about 364 boxes that we've taken off researchers, and they're the standard archiving boxes. They're about this big. So space is a premium in the NHS, so the researchers are quite happy, because most of those actually had to be kept for 25 years, so that's freed up a lot of space. And that's basically what we do. Almost on time. Does anyone have any questions? Let's speed through.